Over the last 5 years, President Richard Nixon's name has been brought up negatively when talking about impeachment investigations. This is because historians and analysts always focus on the negative, like what happened here at the Watergate Hotel and the Oval Office tapes. The combination of National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's practical approach to diplomacy and military defense, mixed with Nixon's belief that the greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker, led the U.S. government to open communications with the semi-isolated Chinese leader Chairman Mao. Nixon's historical visit to China was a new frontier that changed the direction of both the Far East and the world. Southeast Asia had nearly 17 centuries of trade relationships with Europe along the Silk Road. When in the early 1600s, some European countries went from trading with Southeast Asia to claiming the land, gaining control of regional agricultural and natural resources. The completion of the Suez Canal in 1869 made it easier for European countries who were joined by the US and Japan to imperialize Southeast Asia, taking what they wanted while leaving multitudes of Southeast Asians to starve. In 1911, the starvation and poverty led a Chinese revolution, with the overthrown Qing dynasty being replaced by an ongoing conflict between the leaders of the Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. By 1949, with the help of the Soviet Union, the Communists had taken full control of China. During that period, Europe and the United States were focused on World War I and II. Then, after the end of World War II in 1945, they turned their attention back to Southeast Asia. But it was too late, since those 4 decades allowed the Soviet Union to strengthen relationships with Communist China, including helping them push the Japanese out of Manchuria during World War II. That Sino-Russian Communist bond was made even stronger by the U.S. being friendly with anti-CCP Taiwan, letting Japan run wild over Southeast Asia after World War I treaties of Versailles settlement and the U.S. anti-Chinese immigration policies. By 1949, Chairman Mao cut almost all communications with the U.S. and began to support other communist regimes in Southeast Asia, including in Korea and Vietnam. Mao's approach to the U.S. was more like the Great Wall of Silence. That was until the Vietnam War forced the Americans and Chinese to change their diplomatic relationships. A first-person account of how Richard Nixon took America to a new frontier and transformed America's history. I'm talking with President Richard Nixon's deputy assistant in the White House and the author of the book, The President's Man, Dwight Chapin, who oversaw the logistics of Nixon's trip to China and who shares his thoughts of the U.S. and China's historic meeting. Thank you for this interview.
Well, you're welcome, Peter. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to it.
Nixon said the greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker, which was part of the diplomacy he developed traveling around the world as vice president, and in your book you wrote that foreign policy was Nixon's A-game. Do you think it was diplomacy or desperation from the Vietnam War? The violent anti-war movement was opposed to sending more troops to Vietnam and into Cambodia, and America's failing economy that pushed Nixon to move on China?
No, I don't think so. I think when you look at this article that he wrote in 1967, he addresses the subject of Asia after Vietnam. So he was thinking, he was a very visionary person. And he understood the complexities of foreign policy. And he thought in a very broad, sweeping way. So he wasn't going into China because of some desperation or some need to get some kind of a quick solution. He was moving into China because they have 1 billion people. And in his mind, we had to bring them back in, bring them into the world community.
As an important part of Kissinger's second trip to China, you laid the groundwork for Nixon's February 1972 visit. Do you think that Mao's Cultural Revolution, with its famine and re-education camps, along with the border conflicts with the Soviet Union and helping North Vietnam, forced Mao to open relations with the United States?
Mao had come to the conclusion, I think along with Premier Zhou Enlai, that China needed to take advantage of an opportunity to move and open up their country. They had had this closed society, and it was in their interest to start to move out and become part of the world community. So I think that's what was behind it on the Chinese side.
The Shanghai Communique outlined how the U.S. and China normalized relations was the best interest of all countries. how they both wanted to reduce the danger of international maritime conflicts, and how they neither should seek dominance in the Asian Pacific region. It said neither country would negotiate on behalf of third parties or enter into agreements against each other, and that no major country would plot with other major countries to divide the world into spheres of interest. No mention was made of Taiwan since the US and China could not agree on Taiwan. Do you think the communique was more about agreeing not to fight instead of agreeing to make peace?
Yes. The Shanghai communique was really agreed upon at the end of the trip. Now, it was worked on when Kissinger went in 1971 on the trip that I was on. While I was working on the arrangements and all the plans and so forth for the president's trip, Dr. Kissinger was working on the substance. And part of the substance that he was working on was the communique that was to be released at the end of the visit. There was a conflict going on, and China and the United States had been opposing countries for so many years. And so it was hard to write a communique that said, okay, now everything is great. What the communique did was to set up a framework by which over time various things would happen. So they gave it a lot of time, but the important thing in the communique was they agreed to disagree. It was a very unique thing. They didn't agree to agree. They said, you have your views, I have my views, you keep your views, I understand you have very strong views. And the United States said, we're going to keep our views, but we're going to agree that it's okay for us to do that. But we're going to talk to one another. We're going to start a process, and then that would lead to compromise. And in the case of the United States and China, that led to the beginning of trade and the massive amount of trade that the two countries have been doing with one another over the years.
Nixon and Kissinger took advantage of the Soviet Union and China fighting over the border. So what did opening relationships with China do for the U.S. when it came to sitting down with Russia for SALT talks in Moscow 3 months later in May 1972?
Russians were really taken back. The whole world was surprised when it was announced that Nixon was going to go to China. But particularly the Russians were surprised. And they had been negotiating with Nixon through Dr. Kissinger to have the SALT treaties and to limit arms. The first thing the Russians wanted to do and ask is, can you come to Russia before you go to China? They knew that it was more prestigious with Nixon going to China first, and then it was kind of like, okay, now we're going to go to Russia. So all of the negotiations with Moscow were, I would say, intensified by Nixon going to China.
Fast forward over the past 50 years to today, China is the United States' biggest trading partner. They are also the #1 country that sends foreign college students to the U.S., and Americans are now vacationing in China and Vietnam. At the same time, we are fighting with China about influencing U.S. elections and shooting down spy balloons. So what does that mean for the 21st century U.S.-China frontier?
When Nixon went to China 50 years ago, he said, in 50 years, we're going to be adversaries. And we are adversaries. And one of the reasons for my trip is that we need to open our relationships so that in 50 years we are able to talk to one another. And that's where we are now. We have the nation talking to one another. Here's the thing, Peter. The relationship between China and the United States will somehow, over time, get fixed. It's important to both nations that relationship be fixed.
Thank you for this interview, sir.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Bye.